Joining us tonight is Jim Gierach with LEAP. That's Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. This is an organization of former law enforcement and prosecutors, and Jim was a prosecutor in Cook County, and that's in Chicago. He saw some of the worst of drug prohibition. As a matter of fact, he went from someone who believed in the war on drugs to someone who saw the adverse consequences in terms of corruption and violence and futility. Of course, it hasn't helped anyone to get off of drugs. All it has done is destroyed this country. So tonight we want to talk to him about what's going on both in Chicago with renewed violence there, as well as what no one is talking about, and that is the source of the violence in Central and South America, that people are fleeing as they're coming to this country. Thanks for joining us, Jim. And I wanted to ask you, we hear so much about refugees coming into this country because they're fleeing violence in Central and South America, yet nobody is talking about the elephant in the room, and that is, why are MS-13 and Zeta drug gangs, why are they so powerful in those countries? I wanted you to give us your perspective on it as someone who's worked on this for decades in Chicago.
Well, it's hard for people in governmental power and in the news media to call for the legalization of drugs. Everyone knows that the war on drugs doesn't work, but it's a big jump to go from there to say that we need to abandon prohibition, the Al Capone paradigm, and put in place control and regulation of drugs through a system of legalization. Throughout the world, we are all saddled by the same prohibition laws because the United Nations has a treaty that requires that we prohibit all recreational drugs. And the enemy really is this beast right here. This is the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs that requires every drug from heroin to marijuana to be outlawed and to provide criminal penalties and the deprivation of liberty for anyone who violates those treaties. So not just in the United States, not just in Chicago, the home of Al Capone, where violence is epidemic, but in Central America, Honduras, where the murder rate is 90 per 100,000 compared to Chicago, where it's 18 per 100,000. So these Central American states, the violence is horrendously worse than it is here in Chicago, even though I think it's epidemic. Over the July 4th weekend, we had 82 people shot in 84 hours.
Now, there was an uptick in the violence there and the shootings. You've said before when you've been on the show that 80% of the shootings in Chicago were related to drug gang competition, fighting it out for turf wars.
Sure.
Do you think that this recent uptick has anything to do with maybe new Central and South American gangs coming in and starting up a new level of turf war? Because it had dropped to about half of what it was back in the 90s, and so all of a sudden it's had this tremendous increase.
Well, you know, it's summertime, and we started out with a cold, rainy Midwest weather, and kids aren't out playing, they're not out having contact. I really think, you know, the fluctuations are unpredictable. But the only thing that is predictable for sure is that if you have prohibition in place, you're going to have gang violence. Chicago, we have 200,000 gang members. And so there's talk, well, are these Central American gangs coming to the U.S.? Well, certainly they are. They're already here. But we, in Chicago alone, with 200,000 gang members, we have every gang there is covered. And they're fighting over who's going to control the sale and distribution of narcotics. And the reason that they gravitate to that is because when you put prohibition in place, you make something that grows on a plant the most valuable commodity on the face of the earth, so that it causes the very thing that we're trying to prevent. Not just do we have more drugs, which we seize by the ton, evidencing how poor the drug policy works, but the epidemic violence, the gun problem. So you mentioned that the powers that be aren't discussing the real cause. Well, it's easier to talk about guns. People get shot with guns, so let's ban guns, let's restrict guns. I'm in favor of gun control that's reasonable and closing some of the loopholes that exist. But without changing the paradigm of prohibition, this Al Capone violence will continue unstoppable no matter what programs we put in place.
Yeah, we've seen that, gun gun control doesn't really work, because gun prohibition isn't going to work any better than drug prohibition. But going back to Central and South America, I think what we see there is, in a poor country, we see the effects happen much more quickly. Just like if we're going to test a drug, we give it to animals that have a faster metabolism. We can see the effects of that drug more quickly in those animals than we can in humans because of a shorter lifespan. I think when we interject prohibition, we see the end game happening much more quickly in these Central and South American countries, where these gangs have totally corrupted the government there. They have gotten into this kind of level of violence that we haven't seen yet in America. They've diversified into kidnapping, into human trafficking, into all these different areas. But it all started because they were given a monopoly on drugs, drug sales. And of course, we also were pulling that into America in terms of demand. That's where we're headed. Even if we were to keep out all of these Central American gangs, our country is still going to fall into that, it seems to me, if we don't stop prohibition, if we allow this to continue on through its usual lifespan.
You know, there are two elements that come into play. One is the economics of prohibition, where people want something, you outlaw it, and now the price goes astronomically high. Generally, they say there's a 5,000% markup in the price of drugs. But if you take that and you couple it with human nature, which includes, unfortunately, greed, and then you take these substances that we're outlawing, that many of them which have an addictive quality, and you put those things together, it's a Molotov cocktail against the public health, safety, and welfare. And as I think here in just the few minutes that we have together, the single most important thing that we can do to stop this violence worldwide is to amend these United Nations drug prohibition treaties. And I've drafted an amendment that does that. You can find it at leap.cc. And on the first page of leap.cc, there's a link to these proposed treaty amendments that would eliminate the prohibition model, that would put in a health, human rights, and harm reduction type drug policy. It would reinvest the nations of the world with the power and the authority to put in place their own drug rules, not because one size fits all dictated by the United Nations, but because local officials are better able to put reasonable programs in place for the problems in that particular country.
That's the point that the New York Times just made in their editorial over the weekend. It's just yesterday. They came out, the New York Times editorial board said, repeal prohibition again. And they drew parallels to alcohol prohibition, of course. Now, they did not draw parallels to the prohibition problems that we see in Central and South America, but they pointed out that we're seeing this grassroots movement coming up from the states, and yet at the top we see the federal government that is still persecuting people. We've seen many cases in the Midwest where they have medical marijuana. People have been following the state law, and yet the federal government will swoop in, shut down their operation, throw these people in jail for incredibly long period of times because they have these federal mandatory minimum sentences. And yet you're pointing out that even if we change it at the federal level, there's still going to be pressure from the UN. But what mechanism do they have at the UN to enforce that if we were to stop the federal troops from coming in, the DEA from going in and overriding state laws?
Well, the United Nations send out emissaries from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime and the International Narcotics Control Board when the state of Washington and Colorado legalized marijuana.
I remember that. Yeah.
They also dispatched emissaries to try and undo what was being done in Uruguay, the first country in the world to defy these silly United Nations prohibition treaties. Well, they're not silly because they're deadly. Mm-hmm. They're killing people around the world. They're putting more drugs everywhere. The drug prohibition worked so well that this last year in Vienna, at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs at the UN in Vienna, they reported that there were 100 new drugs created synthetically this last year in order to avoid the penalties contained in these prohibition-mandated treaties. And then the nations of the world passing these prohibition. If the drug didn't exist, you can't have outlawed it because it's new. And each year, it's accelerating the number of new synthetic drugs being created faster than they can add them to the UN prohibition lists.
Yeah, we didn't have this problem until they had prohibition. That's the same thing we saw during alcohol prohibition. We saw new and virulent strains of alcohol because that suited the black market. But we've only got about a minute left, Jim.
Sure.
In that minute, give us a take on your impression of what's happened in Colorado, Washington. Has that been a success or failure?
In Colorado, they're anticipating $122 million in taxes that will be coming in by virtue of these sales. Instead of criminalizing people who are doing what's been done for eons, they're recognizing that it's better to control and regulate. The result is crime is down. Fewer juveniles being arrested. Everything you could hope for to come from a better drug policy is what's happening in Colorado. Washington is following shortly behind, and I'm sure that the success there will be equally as positive as in Colorado.
Well, that's good news. We see people on both the left and the right understanding what the problem is. We see Rand Paul going around talking to the NAACP because, of course, this has disproportionately fallen on the black community in terms of incarceration rates, in terms of the punishments inflicted. You can very, very easily show that they get a disproportionate amount of the penalties from this.
The racial discrimination implicit in drug prohibition is epidemic and evident everywhere, as evidenced best maybe by Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow.
Thank you very much for joining us. Jim Gierach with LEAP.cc, that's the website, and you can see that UN proposed amendment that Jim told us about that's there. Support that operation and support our operation. Your subscription to Prison Planet TV can be shared with up to 11 other people at the same time. Of course, it keeps you abreast of the news, and it lets you share all of Alex Jones's documentaries with your friends, with your family, to keep them informed and to keep yourself informed. We're here every weekday night, 7 Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you tomorrow night.
You've experienced and heard about the benefits of Super Male Vitality. Now, the new formula has arrived. Introducing the new Super Female Vitality. I have specifically designed this formula to help the body naturally regulate itself without the use of artificial hormones. Key ingredients chosen from the highest quality sources. Secure your Super Female Vitality today from our limited stock at InfoWarsLife.com.
You are watching the InfoWars Nightly News, which airs 7 p.m. Central at InfoWarsNews.com. Members can share their passcode with up to 11 other people, and your support is helping us defend liberty worldwide.